Welcome to the final lesson in this chapter about building a RESTful API. We have really come a long way from scaffolding our project to introducing our first resource and implementing support for the various HTTP methods, all the way up to this lesson where we are going to discuss introducing support for data shaping inside of a REST API. If you are new to this concept, don't worry, I'll explain what data shaping means. It allows us as API consumers to manipulate the resource representation that we are going to get back from the API. This can be an additional query parameter, typically called fields, where you specify a comma-separated string of fields that you want to get back inside of your API response. This can be very practical to even further reduce the amount of data that's being transferred over the network, and in a way this is similar to how GraphQL queries work, where you define a specific query for the resource representation that you want to get back from the server. Data shaping allows you to do this inside of a REST API, but you have to implement support for this on your own. So let's jump into the code and see how we can implement data shaping. I will continue working from the habits controller, and more specifically the endpoint for retrieving the collection of habits from our API. We already have support for searching and filtering, for pagination, and for sorting of our results. And really the only thing that we are missing is data shaping that we are going to implement in this lesson. So the first thing we need to support is an additional query parameter that is going to represent the fields that we want to get back in our resource representation from the API. So let's define another string property. I will call it fields, and I will define it right after the sort property. Now I can close this down, and then let's see how we are going to implement this. Now I will be implementing data shaping on the materialized data inside of the pagination result. This has two implications. From a performance perspective, it's less efficient than also applying data shaping inside of our projection query. Here is where we are applying the projection. With the current implementation, we are always returning the complete representation of the habit DTO from the database, even when we are applying data shaping using the fields query parameter. Where data shaping is going to play a role is in the results that we return from the API. Now, in order to make this simpler, I'm going to defactor the current implementation a little. I won't be using the helper method exposed by the pagination result, and I will be sending the queries manually. This will make it easier to implement data shaping. So this means a couple of things. First, I have to bring back the total count query into my endpoint. So let's say habits query count async, and this will give me back the total count. Then I need to add the query to fetch the habits, and this I can get by saying habits query skip. Then I need to specify the query page, reduce that by 1, and then multiply by the query page size. This is how many records we skip. Then we take the next query page size records, and finally I can say toList async. And this gives me back a list of habit DTOs. Let's format this so that we can more easily see it. And then I need to update how I'm initializing the pagination result. So I need to pass in the items. These are going to be the habits. Then I need to pass in the page, which I have on the query object, the page size, which I also have on the query object, and the total count that I got from the additional query, and I can omit these lines of code. The reason I'm reverting to this implementation is to make it easier to implement manipulation on the habit DTO list. So let me show you how we are going to do this. I'll create a type in the services folder, and this is going to be my data shaping service. Let's make this a sealed class, and inside of it I'm going to perform data shaping. Now here's how we are going to do this. I'm going to return a collection. It can be an IEnumerable or a list of objects, and the type I'm going to return is an expando object. This is a type in C# from the system dynamic namespace, and it allows you to add the members of this object dynamically at runtime. Let's expose a method called shapeData, and this will be a generic method. It has to be generic because I need to be able to reference what is the type on which I'm performing data shaping. So let me define an IEnumerable, which is going to represent my entities or resources, and then I will have a string containing the fields that I want to include in the data shaped response. Another thing to consider is if we even want the fields to be nullable. We can also take care of this ahead of time and make sure that we don't even apply data shaping if we don't specify the fields. And then the next thing I want to do is to convert the fields parameter from a comma-separated list of strings into a hash set. I'm also going to be performing case-insensitive comparison. And then what we want to do is to iterate over the properties of our generic type, which is type of t, and we can get those properties using the getProperties method. I can specify a couple of binding flags. Let's say I specify public and, for example, instance. And this will give me back an array of property info objects. Now, because reflection can be somewhat expensive, it would be a good idea to cache this so that it can be reusable for subsequent data shaping requests. And the simplest way to achieve this is through a static read-only concurrent dictionary, where the key can be a type and the value is going to be a property info array. Let's call it the properties cache. And I'm going to initialize it to an empty dictionary. And then we can use this inside of the shapeData method and call the getOrAdd method. This is going to give us back the property info array for a given key if it's present in the dictionary, or we can execute a factory function to return the set of property infos. So if we want to return them, then I'm just going to call the getProperties method like we were already doing. And if it's already present in the dictionary, then we're going to return that in the property infos variable. So now that I extracted my fields from the parameter and I have the properties that are available on this type, I can go ahead and iterate over my entities inside of a for each loop. And what we want to do is to initialize a new expando object for each of our entities, and then we want to apply data shaping. We're going to collect all of these instances in a list of expando objects. Let's call this the shaped objects, and this is what we're going to return from our shapeData method. So let's say I've applied my data shaping, which we are going to implement in a moment. Then I can take the shaped objects collection and add a new expando object inside by casting back my dictionary back to an expando object. And now how do we actually implement the data shaping? What we want to do is to only include the properties of this type into the expando object that are present in the specified fields. So I can modify the property infos collection by only selecting the property infos that are present in the fields set. And here is a LINQ expression that does this. And then all we have to do is say property infos for each, and we iterate over the property, and we can say shaped object and access the property info name. This will represent the key of our property. And what we're going to set as the value is called the getValue method and specify the object instance. And this will invoke the property getter and assign the value to the expando object. And this is all there is to it. One improvement I'm going to make is omit the ordinal ignore case here, because I already specified it when creating my hash set, so it's only doing redundant work. And now let's see how we're going to use our data shaping service. I need to register it with dependency injection, so let's do that inside of the program file. Right after the sorting services, I will say builder services add transient and specify the data shaping service. Then I need to inject this inside of my habits controller. Let's say right below the sort mapping provider, I inject the data shaping service, and now we can use this service to perform data shaping. So right here, I need to shape my habits. So inside of the pagination result, I want to shape the habit DTO into an expando object. So what we can do is say data shaping service shape data, and we specify our habits and the fields parameter. And this brings us back to our initial discussion about whether or not this field should be nullable. Let's spend a moment to think about what should happen when this field is null and when it has some values. When the fields parameter is null, we want to return the complete habit DTO. And when it's not null, then we want to apply data shaping. Now, if we were to make this determination in the habits controller, we would have to figure out if we want to return a habit DTO or an expando object. And it's much simpler to just return the expando object directly as the result of our pagination and deal with the value inside of the fields parameter in the data shaping service. So let's revert to our original implementation where the field was nullable, and here we're going to add some fallbacks so that we end up with an empty hash set in case the field is null. And then the key is going to be only performing filtering if we have any fields available inside of our hash set. What this will end up doing is filter out the properties when we want to perform data shaping and include all of the properties in the response when we don't want to do data shaping. Back inside of our controller, everything seems to be compiling. Now, one thing we should update is the return type of this endpoint. It's no longer an action result containing a pagination result of habit DTOs. So let's use iActionResult to describe this because we don't have a proper media type to describe a data shaped response. And now we should be ready to start our application and test out the data shaping implementation that we created so far. Let me first send a request to only fetch the habits, and I will set the page size to 5. By default, this will give me back the first page of results. And you can see that we get a response back, and inside of the response we have our habit DTO representation, but all of the property values are in uppercase. We will fix this later by configuring our serialization, but let's consider what happens when I specify the fields query parameter. Let's say I add the fields, and for example, I just want to return the identifier and the name of the habit. And if I send this request, we get back a response where the resources in the items collection only contain the identifier and the name of the habit.